Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure and self-indulgence. Aristippus, an Athenian philosopher and disciple of Socrates, is the founder of the Cyrenaic school of hedonism, the ethic of pleasure. Pleasure, or the absence of pain, is the most important principle in this ethical framework. All pleasures are seen with very positive importance, and anything to the opposite is of negative importance. Hedonism itself isn't very complex, but can sometimes be quite scary. In today's existential investigation, we're going to be focusing specifically on the book The Picture of Dorian Gray, its three main characters, and how the existential philosophies in this book fights and tangos with the many existential concepts that we've learned this entire semester. The book focuses on four key existential concepts. You have hedonism, the nature of art, the consequences of one's actions, and the duality of human nature. We obviously have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. The book begins with a preface from Oscar Wilde, almost a warning, telling the reader to not search for meaning in the story. He says, in quote, "There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." It's quite the quote coming from Oscar Wilde, especially it being one of the very essential quotes from one of the main characters in the book. And he goes on to state that artists create beautiful things, but all art's quite useless. If that's the case, then Oscar Wilde took me down the most useless phantasmagorical journey that I think I've been on in a very long time. Our three main characters are Dorian Gray, Basil Hallward, and Lord Henry. At the beginning of the novel, Dorian is a young, innocent, and handsome man who's fascinated by the beauty and hedonistic lifestyle of his newfound friend, Lord Henry. Under Lord Henry's influence, Dorian begins to adopt a nihilistic and hedonistic philosophy, which leads him to pursue pleasure and beauty above all else. It was just another day for Dorian Gray. He was walking into Basil's studio just to get his portrait finished, and then he meets Lord Henry, who gives him a speech about the transient nature of beauty and youth, and it's revealed to Dorian that his beauty and his youth are not forever, and that one day he will grow old and ugly. When Dorian Gray sees his stunning painted portrait, he's transfixed by its reflection of his own beauty. He's also troubled by the knowledge that the image in the painting will remain forever handsome while he grows older and less desirable. He professes to both Lord Henry and Basil that he would give his soul if only the painting would suffer the ravages of time and he were to remain forever young. As the old adage goes, be careful what you wish for. And that's exactly what Dorian gets. Under Lord Henry's influence, Dorian begins to adopt a nihilistic and hedonistic philosophy, which leads him to pursue pleasure and beauty above all else. As Dorian becomes more obsessed with his own beauty and youth, he becomes increasingly self-absorbed and callous towards others. He starts indulging in vices like opium and sexual excess, all in an attempt to experience all that life has to offer. Regardless, as Dorian's sins and immoral acts pile up, he starts to be increasingly aware of the transience of life and the inevitability of his death. He starts to become haunted by his own conscience and the portrait of himself, which ages and decays while he remains forever young and beautiful. We'll get to that in a little bit. Dorian's existential progression reaches its climax when he realizes the true nature of his own soul and the price that he's paid for the pursuit of pleasure and beauty. He finally confronts the portrait, which has become a grotesque and disfigured representation of his true self. In a fit of rage and despair, Dorian stabbed the portrait, and it ultimately led to his own death. Basil's introduced as a talented artist who's captivated by Dorian Gray's beauty. He gets obsessed with capturing Dorian's essence in his portraits, and he's deeply affected by Dorian's charm and charisma. The painter is obsessed with the pursuit of beauty and sees it as the highest good. He's deeply committed to his art, and he believes that beauty can save the world. He also struggles with the conflict between an artist's pursuits and his personal life. He realizes that his love for Dorian's incompatible with his art, and it leads him to compromise his principles and ethics. He also begins to reflect on his life and the choices that he's made. He recognizes the danger of his obsession with beauty and realizes that it's blinded him into the realities of life. And as Basil becomes aware of Dorian's corruption and the destructive path that he's on, he recognizes that he played a role in Dorian's downfall and the harm that he caused to others. He's then met with the dilemma of whether to confront Dorian about his corruption or to just be silent. He recognizes that the right thing to do is speak out, but he's ultimately unable to do so. It's mainly because Dorian ends up killing him in his own corruption and madness. And last but not least, we have Lord Henry, who's first introduced as someone who's charming and witty, an aristocrat that enjoys all the pleasures of life. He meets Dorian and he becomes fascinated by him and starts setting in motion events that will lead to Dorian's downfall. Obviously, he's a hedonist. This, I feel like, is the character that Oscar Wilde puts all of his hedonistic perspectives into. He fits some of them into Basil every now and then, just based off of the way that beauty is portrayed and how important it is. But Lord Henry is definitely the most important character, the most pivotal person in this story that changes the course of everything for Dorian and for Basil. And like I said before, Lord Henry's a hedonist, and his philosophy centered around the pursuit of pleasure and beauty, which he believes are the most important things in life. He's the one who introduces Dorian to this philosophy, and he encourages him to indulge his desires without resistance. Lord Henry says, and I quote, "Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it is forbidden to itself." Lord Henry is also oddly a very scientific character, where he explains he believes that influence is neither good or bad. All influence is immoral from a scientific point of view. To influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part of that has not been written for him. As the story progresses, we find that Lord Henry's intentions are quite diabolical with Dorian. He goes on to state, talking to him was like playing upon an exquisite violin. There was something terribly enthralling in the exercise of influence, to project one's soul into some gracious form and let it tarry there for a moment, to hear one's own intellectual views echoed back to one with all the added music of passion and youth, to convey one's own temperament into another as though it were a subtle fluid or a strange perfume. There was a real joy in that. Lord Henry proceeds to say that Dorian could be fashioned into a marvelous type at any rate. There was nothing that one could not do with him. He finalizes his thought in saying he would try to be to Dorian Gray. Without knowing it, the lad was to be the painter who had fashioned the wonderful portrait. He would seek to dominate him, had already, indeed, have done so. He would make that wonderful spirit his own. At this point, you're probably freaking out and saying, what the heck is going on? Why does Lord Henry want to do this? And really, there is no reason to it aside from Lord Henry finds simple pleasure in the fact that he can take away the freedom of Dorian Gray. Now, this kind of directly touches on the stuff that we learned about with Heidegger, truth and freedom. Every truth is a truth in the essence of truth. Because of this, certain truths are held in higher regard than other truths. In this case, the higher truth is the truths in hedonism, and they're leaning more towards the truth in the pursuit of pleasures. And what we're seeing is Lord Henry interjecting his truth onto Dorian and taking away his freedom to experience the world in his own natural way. The world's constantly disclosing itself or undergoing a process of unconcealment. For Dorian to be living in truth, he would need to maintain his innocence as a free being. To his own detriment, Dorian allows for Lord Henry's truths and virtues to become his own. It's really ironic because Lord Henry tells Dorian there's no such thing as good influence, But then he goes on to explain his hedonistic truths and passions and ends up twisting Dorian's arm into becoming his grand piece of influence. And in a way, Lord Henry's suggesting to Dorian to err when he tells him to endeavor into pleasure and to fall into temptation. This undiscovered mystery of the truth met with error produces some sort of correction being. In this case, correcting would be to always yield to temptation and pleasure, no matter the cost. At some point in the story, Dorian starts acting independently of Lord Henry, but everything he does is just an echo of Lord Henry, shadowing how much control that he has over Dorian. And once Dorian meets a girl, her name is Sybil Vane, he wants to stop seeing Lord Henry and just focus on Sybil. This woman is just an actress that he met by watching her in a performance. He ended up falling in love with her without speaking a single word to her, and by the end of the chapter, the two are engaged to marry. But beware, this love is not real. Dorian's ambitions here are to raise a star for America rather than build an actual relationship with her. It's a form of manipulation that he's picked up from Lord Henry, and a large indicator that the dark side of Dorian's true nature is now emerging. This hideousness of Dorian's true nature is fundamental to the truth of his soul oath between himself and his portrait. And while we're on the topic of the portrait, we're going to step into Sass and unreality, madness and modernism. Like Sass's patient Renee, Dorian faces a deep regression of the ego, but to very hedonistic ideas rather than an evolutionary phase. Dorian chases his passions, pleasure, and says or does anything that he wants to people behind closed doors. You also see later in the story, when it progresses, how the painting becomes alive to Dorian, and how this changes Dorian's relationship with the material world. The painting soon has its own agency and vitality that proves worthy of recognition and has a sixth sense of respect in Dorian's mind. Dorian wouldn't just look at the painting, he would stare at all of the imperfections that he created in the painting by seeking pleasure in dealing others pain. Every cruelty, every temptation that he gave into would add ugliness to the painting, giving his face wrinkles, staining his hair gray, staining his teeth, deteriorating his skin and his eyes. He would stare at this obsessively and think about the unspeakable things that he had to do so the painting would become ugly and admire how beautiful and untouched he is. Dorian exhibits unreality, mere being, and fragmentation. Everything to him seems fake when he starts doing these unspeakable acts of evil. There's no authenticity or emotional resonance to him with anything that he does with anybody, including women. His mere being, he loses the meaning and function of who he himself is. He's lost in the thoughts of doing egregious acts while trying to maintain this facade, which is a fragmentation. Things are not coming together in a shared context or meaning. He is living his life dependent on the fact that if he does evil things, that good things will happen to him, which becomes a pleasure to him in a sixth sense, which becomes his epiphany. It's very excruciatingly sick in a sense, but this is the way that Oscar Wilde wrote this book, and this is the way that he intended it. This is why he said to not look into this book, do not take it seriously. It gets crazy. One of the most toxic things about this book, I love this book. I'm saying toxic because it just is the way that it is. It will take away the innocence of the situation, and you watch Dorian lose his own innocence. It's very reminiscent to the things that Kierkegaard touched on when we discussed anxiety. Before Dorian met Lord Henry, he was innocent and unaware of the difference between himself and others. After his talk with Lord Henry, his awareness of the possibility of his youth ending tragically with him old and ugly is a possibility that is yet to happen. It's something that's not there. So Lord Henry's created this anxiety inside of Dorian. With his words, Dorian now bends to the hedonistic ideals of Lord Henry's life philosophies. Dorian begins to live unauthentically. And yet he is guilty, for he sank into anxiety, which he nevertheless loved, even as he feared it. The prohibition induces in him anxiety, for the prohibition awakens in him freedom's responsibility. And Dorian's definitely responsible for his own actions, because he is the one that's feeding his own anxieties. He's taking pleasure in feeding his own anxiety. Later on in the book, Dorian says that he doesn't want to be at the mercy of his own emotions. He wants to use them, to enjoy them, and to dominate them, which suggests that he wants to be in control of his own life and emotions rather than being ruled by them, which to me, it directly feeds into what Beauvoir said about he asserts himself as a pure internality against which no external power can take hold, and he also experiences himself as a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. I'm thinking that the external power, no external power can take hold. It's his emotions can't control him. He can control them. And the dark weight of things crushing him is his anxiety of him growing old and ugly, and also the painting. And Dorian's truly locked in his own body. He's threatened with the potentials of ugliness and old age. And who's done this to him? It's Lord Henry. He's the person who constituted the meaning of the limitations of his body. This new dimension of Dorian's body is now known through Lord Henry, giving him the details of the ugliness and old age that he's going to be seeing in the coming future. At this point, Dorian's impregnated with the wisdom which language has brought him, and it's a form of alienation from his own experiences of life or pain in old age. I'm taking all these things from Sartre, and when I look more into it, Lord Henry kind of follows Sartre's line of thinking at first, but as events unfold, Lord Henry decides to become the foundation for a new Dorian Gray. In quote, Sartre says, "I am responsible for my being for others, but I am not the foundation of it. How can I be responsible for my being for others if I am not the foundation?" In this case, Lord Henry is the being for others. He is the foundation now for Dorian Gray, and he perfectly executed it through the entire book. And sadly, it ended bad for Dorian Gray because he realized the inauthenticity that was in his life, and he realized that everything that he was doing was tearing him apart. All of these dead bodies started falling out of his closet all around him, and he couldn't take it anymore. So, what does he do? He tries to take it out on his painting. He goes to try and attack it, but what actually happens? Somehow he dies. But when everybody finds him and they find his body, he's old and he's ugly, and the painting is completely untouched. We've reached the end, guys. I appreciate y'all for watching this, and I hope everyone has a really fun and safe summer. Thanks for being in this class with me. I learned a whole lot with you guys, and as always, take care.